"You should really just stay in the kitchen," Serafina sneered, her acrylic nail tapping on the marble island. "It's what you're good at, isn't it?" She was picking out new curtains for a house that wasn't hers, for a life she had stolen. But what she didn't know, what her billionaire lover had forgotten, was that the kitchen held the truth. It wasn't just a place of pots and pans. It was where the entire empire began. And in a dusty, leather-bound book, tucked behind a row of spices, was a kitchen ledger that would soon become the single most explosive piece of evidence in a New York courtroom, turning a tale of betrayal into the most satisfying story of justice you've ever heard. The crystal glasses chimed, a fragile sound against the backdrop of polite laughter and the distant hum of downtown Chicago. It was the 20th anniversary party for Richard and Abigail Davenport, an event that Chicago Society magazine had already dubbed the event of the season. Their Lakeshore Drive penthouse was a monument to success, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a god's eye view of the glittering city and the dark, quiet expanse of Lake Michigan. Richard Davenport, a man who had practically built his real estate empire from skyline to skyline, was the perfect host. He moved through the crowd with an easy smile, a hand on this person's shoulder, a shared laugh with that one. He was Rich Davenport, a name that was both a descriptor and a destiny. And then there was Abigail. Abigail, in a simple navy blue dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, was the silent engine that made the entire evening run. While Richard charmed, Abigail managed. She was the one who personally consulted with the caterers, ensuring the canapés were warm and the champagne was perfectly chilled. She was the one who noticed a guest's empty glass from across the room, the one who knew the mayor was allergic to shellfish, the one who made everyone feel comfortable. "Abby, darling, you've outdone yourself again," a friend, Catherine, murmured, squeezing her arm. "This entire setup is flawless." "Thank you, Catherine. I just want everything to be perfect for Richard," Abigail replied, with a warm, genuine smile. But as she watched her husband, a small, cold knot tightened in her stomach. For the last 6 months, perfect had felt like a costume. Richard was here, but he was absent. His smiles didn't quite reach his eyes. His phone, a sleek, black monolith, was a constant presence in his hand, drawing his attention away even mid-conversation. He'd become a man of secrets, of late nights, at the office, and business trips that popped up with no notice. Abigail, however, was a woman of patience. She believed in vows. She believed in the man she had met 25 years ago, the ambitious, charming, and slightly clumsy young man who had spilled coffee all over her textbooks at the university library. She had built this life with him. She could weather this storm. The party wound down. The last guests departed, leaving a trail of compliments and empty glasses. The catering staff, whom Abigail had tipped generously, cleared the last of the debris. Finally, they were alone. The penthouse was silent, save for the hum of the city below. "It was a wonderful party, Richard," Abigail said, unpinning her hair. Oh yes, good turnout. Good for the brand," he replied, loosening his tie as he stared at his phone. The cold knot in Abigail's stomach turned to ice. "The brand? Richard, it was our anniversary." He sighed, a sound of profound irritation, and tossed the phone onto the granite countertop. "Abigail, can we not do this? I'm tired." "Do what? Try to connect with my husband?" Her voice was quiet, but it trembled. "You've been a ghost, Richard. For months. I deserve to know what's wrong." Richard looked at her, and for the first time in years, the mask of the charming mogul was gone. His eyes were cold, assessing, like a banker looking at a bad investment. "You're right," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. You do deserve to know. I'm leaving you, Abigail." The words hung in the air, sterile and sharp. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "What? Well, what are you talking about? Is this a joke? Because of the party?" "This has nothing to do with the party," he said, walking to the bar and pouring himself a whiskey. He didn't offer her one. "I'm in love with someone else. Her name is Seraphina Vance. She's not like you. She's vibrant. She understands my world." "Your world?" Abigail whispered, gripping the back of a chair to steady herself. "The world I helped you build. The world that started in our one-bedroom apartment with me balancing the books on the coffee table." Richard actually scoffed. "Oh, Abby, don't be so dramatic. You balanced a checkbook. I built an empire. Let's not confuse the two." He took a sip of his drink. "Look, I'm prepared to be very generous. I'll have my lawyer, Marcus Stone, send over the papers. You'll be comfortable. You can keep the condo in Florida. But do not fight me on this. You will not win." Abigail stared at him. This stranger wearing her husband's face. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by this cold, ruthless creature. Who is she?" "Seraphina. She's an interior designer. In fact, she's been consulting on the new hotel project. The one you spent the last 2 weekends at." "Yes," he said, without a trace of shame. "I'm selling this penthouse. Seraphina and I are buying a place in Lincoln Park. A fresh start." "And me?" Abigail's voice was barely audible. "What am I? Just old inventory? To be sold off?" "Don't be sentimental, Abigail. It doesn't suit you," he said, finishing his whiskey. "You were a good wife. You were comfortable. But I don't want to be comfortable anymore. I want to live." He walked past her, toward their bedroom, his bedroom apparently, and paused. "Stone will have the papers to you by Monday. I suggest you find a lawyer, though it won't make a difference. The prenup is ironclad." Abigail's head snapped up. The prenup? Richard, we never signed a prenup." A small, cruel smile played on his lips. "We did, Abby. 10 years ago, when I incorporated Davenport Holdings. You signed a post-nuptial agreement. You just thought it was tax paperwork. I told you not to worry your pretty little head about it." He disappeared into the bedroom, and the quiet click of the door shutting echoed in the cavernous room like a gunshot. Abigail was left alone, surrounded by the wreckage of her perfect life, the scent of expensive champagne and betrayal thick in the air. The 3 days that followed were a blur of numb disbelief and sharp, stabbing pain. Abigail moved through the penthouse like a ghost. Richard was gone, having moved into one of his own hotel suites. The silence of the 10,000-square-foot space was suffocating. On Monday, as promised, a sleek, black-clad messenger delivered a comically thick envelope. The papers from Marcus Stone. Abigail sat at her kitchen island, the one place that had always felt like hers, and opened it. The offer was clinical. It was an insult wrapped in legalese. She was offered the condo in Naples, Florida, which she knew was heavily mortgaged, and a lump sum alimony payment of $500,000. $500,000. It sounded like a lot, until she realized that the painting on the wall across from her, a stark, abstract piece Richard had bought at an art gala, was worth 3 times that. Davenport Holdings was valued at nearly $2 billion. The post-nup he had mentioned was stapled to the front. She stared at her own signature on the last page. She remembered that day. Richard had been so excited, so full of energy. "Just signing some papers to protect us from taxes, darling. It'll put everything under one umbrella. Just sign here, here, and here." She had been baking a lemon thyme chicken for dinner. She had wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and signed, her trust in him as absolute as the law of gravity. She was being erased. 25 years of partnership, of support, of sacrifice, reduced to a $500,000 severance package. She thought of calling one of the high-priced corporate law firms Richard used, but she knew they would never cross him. They were his lawyers, his friends. Instead, she remembered a name from a woman at her old church, a woman who had gone through a messy divorce herself. "Helen Reed," the woman had said. "She's not flashy, but she's a shark in a sensible suit." Helen Reed's office was not in a glittering downtown tower. It was in a modest building, in a quieter neighborhood, the kind of place with old hardwood floors that creaked and smelled faintly of floor polish and old books. Helen herself was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense bun. Abigail, feeling small and humiliated, laid out the papers. Helen read them, her expression unchanging. She read for nearly 20 minutes in complete silence. Finally, she looked up, her gaze piercing. "Mrs. Davenport," she said, her voice crisp, "this isn't an offer, it's an execution. This post-nup gives him everything. The house, the company, the art, the cars. It defines your contribution to the marriage as domestic and emotional support, explicitly waiving any claim to business assets." She tapped the signature. "Is this yours?" "Yes," Abigail whispered. I thought it was for taxes. He told me." "He told you not to worry your pretty little head," Helen finished, her voice grim. "I've seen this before. The trusting wife portfolio. It's designed to be ironclad." "So that's it?" Abigail felt the last wisp of hope evaporate. "I get a condo and $500K for 25 years of my life?" Helen leaned forward. "This document says you have no claim to business assets. But what if we could prove that some of the assets aren't business assets? What if we could prove they're marital assets he disguised?" She paused. "Tell me about the beginning, Abigail. Before the billions, before Davenport Holdings. Tell me everything." So Abigail did. She talked about her small bakery, Abby's Hearth, which she had opened right out of college. She talked about her grandmother's recipes, the loyal clientele, the catering contracts she'd won. She talked about Richard, then a struggling junior agent, and how she'd supported them both for those first 4 years. Helen was scribbling notes, her pen flying. "A bakery? Did you have a business license? A separate bank account?" "Yes, of course," Abigail said. "It was my baby. I closed it down, or rather, folded it into Richard's company, about 15 years ago. He said it was smarter for tax purposes to run the catering for his corporate events in-house. It just faded away after that. He said it was too small time to focus on." "Folded it in," Helen repeated, her eyes lighting up. "We need the paperwork for that. We need the original incorporation papers for Abby's Hearth and the documents showing its dissolution or merger." I might have them," Abigail said. "In the attic, in my old baking boxes." "Go find them," Helen said, her voice firm. "Find anything related to that bakery." Abigail returned to the penthouse with a flicker of purpose. She went to the pristine, climate-controlled storage room, the attic, and found the boxes labeled Hearth. They were dusty, forgotten. She was kneeling on the floor, sifting through old menus and tax forms, when she heard the click-clack of heels on the marble floor behind her. "My God, this place is even bigger than I thought. The staging is so dated, though." Abigail froze. She stood up and turned. There, in the middle of her living room, was a stunningly beautiful woman in her late 20s. She wore a red dress that was aggressively tight and held a large, ostentatious snakeskin handbag. This was Seraphina Vance. Who are you? How did you get in here? Abigail stammered. Richard gave me a key, of course, Seraphina said, waving a dismissive hand as she inspected the sofa. He wanted me to get a head start on the redesign. We're going to gut this whole place. It's so beige. Abigail felt a rage so cold and pure it almost made her dizzy. This is still my home. You have no right to be here. Seraphina let out a tinkling, obnoxious laugh. Oh, sweetie, let's be real. It's Richard's home. You're just you're the soon-to-be ex-wife. I'm the future. He told me you'd be difficult. She wandered over to the kitchen, her eyes scanning the professional-grade Wolf range and Sub-Zero refrigerators. Abigail had been packing a few of her most cherished items, her grandmother's rolling pin, her old recipe journals. They were on the counter. Seraphina picked up a worn, leather-bound book. What's this? Recipes? She flipped through it with a look of distaste. Cute. Look, Abigail, is it? I'm going to give you some free advice. Richard is a shark. You're a goldfish. You can't win against him. Just take the little payout he's offering and go quietly. Get out of my house, Abigail said, her voice low and dangerous. Fine. I just needed to measure the windows. Seraphina pulled out a laser measure from her bag. As she walked past Abigail, she paused, looking at the baking supplies on the counter. You know, she said, a cruel smirk on her glossed lips. Richard told me you used to be a little baker. How quaint. Listen, don't worry your pretty little head about the divorce. The lawyers, the numbers. That's our world. You should really just stay in the kitchen. It's what you're good at, isn't it? The words hit Abigail like a physical blow. Stay in the kitchen, the place she had been relegated to, the place her talent had been reduced to a hobby. As Seraphina turned to measure the drapes, her back to her, Abigail looked down at the box she was holding, and underneath a stack of old order forms, she saw it. Another leather-bound book. It wasn't a recipe book. The spine was labeled, in her own neat cursive, Abby's Hearth, Expenses and Loans. Her heart stopped. She had forgotten it even existed. Get out, Abigail said again, her voice no longer trembling. It was as cold and hard as the marble under her feet. Seraphina raised an eyebrow, surprised by the change in tone. Whatever. I'll be back when you and your flower are gone. As the front door slammed shut, Abigail was left alone. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage. She opened the book. The first entry, dated 24 years ago. Loan to R. Davenport, for first property venture, Elmwood Park duplex, $15,000. She flipped the page. And another, and another. Loan to R. Davenport, for second property, Lakeview flip, $25,000. Transfer to Davenport Ventures account, seed capital, $50,000. It was all there. Every penny she had earned, every dollar from her thriving bakery that she had poured into his ventures, all meticulously documented in her own hand. Seraphina was right. The answer was in the kitchen, but it wasn't the one she thought. Abigail didn't call Helen Reed. She drove. She clutched the kitchen ledger to her chest like a shield. The modest, unassuming book felt heavier than all the gold in Richard's vault. She burst into Helen's office, bypassing the secretary. I found it, she said, her voice breathless. She laid the book on Helen's desk. Helen, ever the professional, simply raised an eyebrow, opened the ledger, and began to read. The silence in the room stretched, broken only by the sound of Helen's finger tracing the neat, cursive lines of Abigail's meticulous records. Abigail had recorded everything. Dates, transfer amounts, check numbers, and, most importantly, purpose. Seed capital, investment for incorporation, covering brokerage fees. After a full 30 minutes, Helen closed the book, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at Abigail. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "Abigail," she said, her voice brimming with a newfound energy, "this isn't a ledger. It's a loaded gun. That post-nup you signed? It waives your right to his business assets. But this proves that Davenport Holdings was never his business to begin with. It was a joint venture." "It was?" Abigail asked, hope and confusion warring within her. "Legally, yes, he used your capital from your existing, successful, sole proprietorship, to fund his new corporation. He didn't borrow money, Abigail. He commingled assets. You weren't his wife. You were his first, uncredited and unpaid investor." Helen stood up and began to pace. "That post-nup hinges on the idea that he built the empire and you were the homemaker. This ledger proves that narrative is a lie. You weren't the homemaker. You were the bank." She pointed to a line in the ledger. "This $50,000 transfer, dated March 1999, the one labeled for incorporation of Davenport Holdings. This is our key. His entire $2 billion company was built on the foundation of Abby's Hearth. He didn't just absorb your bakery to save on taxes, as he claimed. He consumed it." But what about the post-nup I signed?" Abigail said, the old fear returning. "My signature is on it." "We're going to challenge it," Helen said, her eyes gleaming. "We're going to argue fraud in the inducement. He misrepresented the very nature of the document. But this ledger, this is our leverage. Marcus Stone thinks he's fighting a goldfish. It's time to show him he's in a tank with a great white." The first shot was fired. Helen Reed filed a formal challenge to the post-nuptial agreement and a motion for a full forensic audit of Davenport Holdings, citing the ledger as evidence of financial commingling and fraudulent misrepresentation. The reaction from Richard's side was swift and arrogant. Marcus Stone, Richard's lawyer, was a caricature of a high-powered attorney. Slicked-back hair, a $10,000 suit, and a voice that dripped with condescension. He demanded a deposition. They met in a sterile conference room in Stone's high-rise office. Richard was there, looking bored and irritated. Serafina was not, which Abigail was grateful for. Stone began the deposition with a sneer. "Mrs. Davenport, let's cut to the chase. My client offered you a more than generous settlement. This kitchen ledger." He chuckled, as if sharing a joke with the stenographer. "It's a cute little hobby book, a diary. It's not a legal document. It's a record of all the capital my business, Abby's Hearth, provided to my husband to found his business," Abigail said calmly. Helen had coached her for hours. "Stay calm. State facts." "Your business?" Stone scoffed. "You mean the little bakery you ran? The one that, according to our records, you happily sold to Mr. Davenport 15 years ago for a tidy sum?" Abigail's blood ran cold. "What? I never sold it." Stone smiled, a predator's smile. He slid a single piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. "Then I'm sure you'll recognize this. It's a purchase agreement, dated May 2005. You, Abigail Davenport, sell all assets, branding, and goodwill of Abby's Hearth to Davenport Holdings in exchange for the sum of $50,000. He tapped the last page. "And that is your signature, is it not?" Abigail stared at the document. It was her name. It looked like her signature, but she had no memory of this. $50,000? For the business she had built from scratch, the business that had funded his first million. It was insane. I don't remember this," she said, her voice faltering. "Of course you don't," Stone said soothingly. "It was 15 years ago, a small transaction. You took the money, Mr. Davenport absorbed the hobby, and that was that. Your kitchen ledger, Mrs. Davenport, is irrelevant. It's a record of debts that were settled and a business that was sold." Richard, who had been silent, finally spoke. "It's over, Abby," he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a death sentence. "You were happy to take the money then. Don't be greedy now. Take the deal. Go to Florida. Be comfortable." Abigail looked at the paper, then at her husband, then at her lawyer. Helen Reed was staring at the document, her expression unreadable. The deposition was over. Stone was triumphant. Richard was relieved. Abigail and Helen rode the elevator down in silence. As the doors opened to the lobby, Abigail finally broke. He did it again. I must have signed it. He must have slipped it in with other papers." The fight drained out of her, replaced by a crushing, overwhelming wave of defeat. "He's right, I'm a goldfish." They stepped out onto the busy Chicago street, the wind whipping around the buildings. Helen Reed stood still, a small smile playing on her lips. "He's overplayed his hand, Abigail," Helen said quietly. "What?" "Helen, you saw the paper. I'm finished." "No," Helen said, her eyes bright with a hunter's glint. "He's finished. He thinks he's plugged the leak, but he's just blown a hole in the side of the ship." "I don't understand." "That signature, Abigail. It's good. It's too good. It's a perfect match for your signature today." "But is it a perfect match for your signature 15 years ago?" Helen hailed a cab. "People's signatures evolve. They change. His mistake was creating a smoking gun. He should have stuck to the post-nup, but he got greedy. He had to erase the bakery entirely. So, what do we do?" "Now," Helen said, holding the cab door open, "we hire a forensic document examiner, and we don't just ask if you signed it. We ask when." The weeks leading up to the preliminary hearing were a storm of legal activity. Helen Reed was no longer just a lawyer. She was a general. She filed motions, subpoenaed bank records from 20 years ago, and, most importantly, she engaged the services of a man named Dr. Miles Harrison. Dr. Harrison was not a shark. He was a quiet, meticulous man with spectacles perched on his nose and a love for microscopes. He was one of the foremost forensic document examiners in the country. Abigail, meanwhile, was forced to endure the public humiliation of her new life. Richard and Serafina were now the darlings of the Chicago gossip columns. They were photographed at the opening of a new restaurant, a Linnea, looking blissful. There was Serafina, draped on Richard's arm, wearing a diamond necklace that Abigail recognized, one Richard had given her on their 15th anniversary. The press, fed by leaks from Richard's team, painted Abigail as a scorned wife, a gold digger in reverse, who was trying to undo a fair agreement out of spite. The kitchen ledger was mocked as a housewife's fantasy. Abigail stopped reading the news. She focused. She helped Helen's team, digging up old bank statements that matched the ledger entries, finding the original incorporation papers for Abby's Hearth, a sole proprietorship, just as she'd said, and crucially, providing samples of her signature from that era, old checks, letters, her passport. 2 days before the hearing, Helen called her. "He's here. Dr. Harrison. Can you come to the office?" When Abigail arrived, Dr. Harrison had a series of high-resolution images projected on a screen in the conference room. "Mrs. Davenport," he began in his precise academic tone. "On the left, you will see your known exemplar signature from 2005, taken from a check you wrote to your utilities company. On the right, the questioned signature from the purchase agreement." Abigail stared. It looks the same." "At first glance, yes," Dr. Harrison agreed. "The forger was skilled. They clearly traced or practiced your signature extensively. The letter formation, the slant. It's a very good forgery. But," he smiled faintly, "they were not a paper and ink historian." He zoomed in on the signature from the purchase agreement until the blue line of the ballpoint pen became a thick, grainy river. "Ink is a chemical compound, Mrs. Davenport. Like a fingerprint. Manufacturers are constantly changing their formulas. Using a process called gas chromatography, we can break this ink down into its component parts." He put up another slide, a complex-looking graph. "The ink on this document, the one you supposedly signed in 2005, contains a specific patented dye compound, sea blue 113. It's a lovely, stable dye. The only problem is..." He paused for dramatic effect. "It wasn't invented until 2009, and it wasn't used commercially by any major pen manufacturer until the Uni-Jetstream line was released in late 2010. Abigail felt the air leave her lungs. "So," Helen Reed spoke, her voice cutting through the silence. "So, it is chemically and physically impossible for you to have signed that document in 2005. This document," she tapped a copy of the purchase agreement, "was created at the earliest, in 2010. Long after he had you sign the post-nup. Long after he had already looted your company's assets. He faked it," Abigail whispered. "He committed forgery. He lied." "He didn't just lie, Abigail," Helen said, her voice hard. "He committed a felony. He's not just a cheating husband. He's a common criminal. And he just handed us the very tool we need to invalidate not just the purchase agreement, but the entire post-nuptial agreement as well." Dr. Harrison, looking pleased, added one more detail. "There's also the matter of the paper, Mrs. Davenport. The document was dated 2005, but our analysis of the watermark shows it was from a batch of hammermill paper produced in 2012. He wasn't just sloppy, he was arrogant." Arrogant. That was the word. Richard, the master of the universe, the man who built skyscrapers, had been brought down by a microscopic drop of ink and a watermark. He, and his high-priced lawyer, Marcus Stone, had been so sure of Abigail's passivity, so certain she was just a kitchen-bound wife, that they didn't even bother to cover their tracks properly. They had fabricated a document to plug a hole, and in doing so, had created a canyon. "So what now?" Abigail asked, her hands shaking, but this time with adrenaline. "Now," Helen said, gathering the reports into a fresh binder, "we go to court, and we don't just ask for a fair settlement. We ask for everything." Helen's strategy was brilliant. They weren't just arguing about the division of assets anymore. They were now arguing that the entire foundation of the marriage, from 2005 onward, was based on fraud. The post-nup was void because it was signed under fraudulent pretenses. He had already, at that point, planned to steal her company. The purchase agreement was void, as a blatant forgery. This meant the commingling of assets was back on the table. And since Abby's Hearth had provided the entire seed capital for Davenport Holdings, Helen was prepared to argue a case that made Abigail's jaw drop. "We will argue," Helen stated, "that Davenport Holdings is not a corporation to be divided. We will argue that it is, in fact, the continuing legal alter ego of your original sole proprietorship, Abby's Hearth. He didn't build a new company. He just put a new, fraudulent name on yours." The courtroom was packed. The divorce of Richard Davenport was high-stakes drama, and the press, along with half of Chicago's social elite, had turned out to watch. Richard, looking tanned and confident, sat with his lawyer, Marcus Stone. They chatted amiably, as if waiting for a business meeting to start. In the front row, just behind Richard, sat Seraphina Vance. She was dressed in a pristine white suit, a strategic, angelic choice that was ruined by the massive canary-yellow diamond on her left hand, the engagement ring. She looked smug, occasionally glancing back at Abigail with a look of pitying contempt. Abigail sat with Helen Reed, her posture straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore the same simple navy blue dress she had worn to her anniversary party. It was her armor. The hearing was before Judge Elizabeth Chen, a woman notorious for her sharp intellect and her absolute intolerance for theatrics and liars. Marcus Stone, for the prosecution, in a divorce, the petitioner, laid out his case with slick confidence. Your Honor, this is a simple matter. A marriage has unfortunately run its course. A valid post-nuptial agreement was signed by two consenting adults. We are here today simply to enforce that agreement and finalize the dissolution. The respondent, he gestured to Abigail, has been offered a settlement that is, frankly, astounding for her. Contribution to the marriage. We ask the court to enforce the agreement and dismiss the respondent's frivolous counterclaims. He sat down. It was clean, simple, and arrogant. Then Helen Reed stood up. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm and clear. We are not here to contest a simple post-nup. We are here to present evidence of a calculated, multi-decade campaign of felony fraud, forgery, and financial malfeasance. A murmur went through the crowd. Richard's smile faltered. Seraphina stopped examining her nails. Mr. Stone's entire case, Helen continued, rests on the fantasy that Mr. Davenport built his empire alone, while my client, Mrs. Davenport, kept the kitchen. Today we are going to prove that that very kitchen was, in fact, the corporation's first headquarters, its first investor, and its sole, rightful owner. The day was a blur of testimonies. Helen first called a forensic accountant who, using Abigail's kitchen ledger and the subpoenaed bank records, laid out an undeniable dollar-for-dollar trail. As you can see, the accountant explained, pointing to a complex flowchart, 100% of the initial seed capital for the LLC Davenport Ventures, which later became the corporation Davenport Holdings, came directly from the business account of Abby's Hearth, a sole proprietorship owned by Abigail Davenport. Marcus Stone objected. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. We have a signed purchase agreement from 2005. Abby's Hearth was legally purchased. This is ancient history. Is it? Helen smiled. I'd like to call my next witness, Dr. Miles Harrison, forensic document examiner. Richard Davenport, who had been whispering angrily to Stone, now went very, very still. Dr. Harrison was sworn in. He was the perfect witness, calm, academic, and utterly certain. He laid out his findings with methodical precision. The gas chromatography, the ink, the dye compound, sea blue 113. And so, Dr. Harrison, Helen concluded, in your professional expert opinion, what is the probability that this document was signed on the date it claims, May 15th, 2005? Zero probability, Counselor, Dr. Harrison stated simply. The ink used on the signature did not exist for another 4 years. The document is a fabrication. The courtroom exploded. The press was scribbling frantically. Judge Chen banged her gavel. Order! Order in my court! She looked at Marcus Stone, her eyes narrowed to slits. Mr. Stone, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? Stone, for the first time, was sweating. He was shuffling his papers, his arrogance completely gone. Your Honor, this is a trick, a desperate. We dispute this expert's findings. We need a recess to consult our own expert. You had months to consult your own expert, Mr. Stone, Judge Chen said, her voice like ice. You submitted this document into evidence. You vouched for it, and this court finds it has been presented with a forgery." She turned her gaze to Richard Davenport. He had gone a pale, chalky grey. He was staring at Helen Reed as if seeing her for the first time. Seraphina, in the front row, was whispering, "Richard, Richard, fix this. Tell them they're lying." Helen Reed wasn't finished. "Your Honor, this forgery is the key. It was created to sever my client's claim to her original business, a business that, as our accountant proved, was the sole seed capital for Davenport Holdings. Mr. Davenport didn't buy his wife's company. He stole it. And when he thought she might discover the theft during this divorce, he and his counsel, or he alone, committed felony fraud by fabricating this document to cover his tracks." "Objection!" Stone yelled, finding his voice. "Counsel is accusing me of—" "Sustained," Judge Chen snapped. "But only as it pertains to counsel. The accusation against your client, however, is now a matter of court record, supported by expert testimony." The room was silent. The air crackled. Richard Davenport, the titan of industry, was trapped. His own lie, his own arrogance, had cornered him. He had been so obsessed with Seraphina, so dismissive of Abigail, that he had built his entire case on a lie so flimsy a single drop of ink could wash it all away. The hearing's final day was less a legal proceeding and more a coronation and an execution. Judge Chen had reviewed all the evidence overnight. The mood was somber. Richard Davenport looked like a broken man. His lawyer, Marcus Stone, was visibly shaken, his career likely in tatters for submitting a fraudulent document. Seraphina was there, but the smugness was gone. She looked terrified, her eyes wide, clinging to Richard's arm, not as a lover, but as a shipwreck survivor clings to a piece of driftwood. Judge Chen entered, and the room went silent. She didn't waste time. "I have reviewed all testimony and evidence presented," she began, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The matter of this divorce is secondary to the matter of the fraud presented to this court. The purchase agreement, dated 2005, is hereby struck from the record and has been forwarded to the district attorney's office for a criminal investigation into forgery and perjury." Richard let out a small, strangled sound. "Because this document is fraudulent," Judge Chen continued, "it cannot be used to sever the respondent's claim. Therefore, we must look at the original commingling of assets. The evidence is irrefutable. Davenport Holdings was founded using 100% of its initial capital from the plaintiff's sole proprietorship, Abby's Hearth. She then turned to the post-nuptial agreement, the one Richard had been so proud of. This court finds that the post-nuptial agreement is also void. It is a textbook case of fraud in the inducement. Mr. Davenport, you had your wife sign a document waiving her rights to your business, all while knowing that said business was, in fact, hers. You misrepresented the very nature of the document and your financial reality. It is null." Marcus Stone slumped in his chair, defeated. "Therefore," the judge said, "this is not a simple division of assets. This is a restoration. But the question is, how to restore?" Helen Reed stood up. "Your Honor, if I may? We have a final motion." Judge Chen nodded. "Proceed, Counselor." "Your Honor, for 20 years my client, Abigail Davenport, was systematically defrauded. Her assets, her intellectual property, her recipes and business model, and her capital were stolen and used to build an empire that excluded her. We believe that simply awarding her half of the marital assets would be an injustice. It would, in effect, allow Mr. Davenport to profit from his 2-decade-long criminal enterprise. We are therefore asking the court to invoke the unclean hands doctrine." Richard's head snapped up. No, Helen continued, her voice ringing with power. The petitioner, Richard Davenport, has come to this court seeking equitable relief with unclean hands. He has lied, he has forged, and he has built an empire on a criminal act. We argue that he has forfeited his right to any equitable relief. We argue that Davenport Holdings is, and always has been, the legal alter ego of Abby's Hearth. We are not asking for a division. We are asking for a return. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Marcus Stone was frantically flipping through his books, but he knew he was beaten. The forgery had opened this door. Judge Chen looked at Richard Davenport. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. Mr. Davenport, you stand before this court as a man who built a $2 billion empire by defrauding your wife. You took her talent, her trust, and her money, and you spun it into gold, all while telling her to stay in the kitchen. You then had the audacity to try and discard her with pennies, using a forged document to cement your crime. The unclean hands doctrine is not just applicable here, it is screaming to be invoked. She raised her gavel. This court finds that Davenport Holdings is the product of sustained and egregious fraud. The corporate veil is pierced. The court finds that the assets, properties, and accounts of Davenport Holdings are the sole and rightful property of the plaintiff, Abigail Davenport, as the continuing entity of her original business, Abby's Hearth. The entire estate is awarded to the plaintiff, Abigail Davenport. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It was not a 50-50 split. It was 100 to Ururo. Richard Davenport made a guttural noise and slumped forward, his head in his hands. But it was Serafina who truly broke. Her face, a mask of terror, contorted into a primal scream. "No, no, you can't!" she shrieked, standing up. "He told me. He said it was his. The house, the money. You, Baker!" "Bailiff, remove her," Judge Chen commanded. Serafina was hysterical, fighting as two large bailiffs grabbed her arms. "This is your fault," she screamed, pointing a trembling, red-nailed finger at Abigail. "You were supposed to be nothing. He said you were nothing." As they dragged her from the courtroom, her cries of, "It's not fair, it's mine," echoed down the hall. The room was left in stunned silence. Richard was sobbing quietly. Abigail stood up, her entire body shaking, not with fear, but with release. She looked at the broken man who had been her husband. She looked at the empty seat where his mistress had been. She turned, met Helen Reed's eye, and Helen gave her a single, triumphant nod. Abigail then walked, with quiet dignity, out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage of Richard's life behind her. The fallout from the verdict was immediate and brutal. The district attorney's office, armed with Judge Chen's scathing findings and Dr. Harrison's irrefutable evidence, filed criminal charges against Richard Davenport for felony fraud and forgery. Faced with the scientific proof of the ink and paper, a trial was unwinnable. He pleaded guilty. The man who had once graced the cover of Forbes was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in a state penitentiary. The SEC, alerted by the DA, launched its own investigation, freezing the few personal assets he'd tried to hide offshore. The press, which had once fawned over his every move, now vilified him. They had a new name for him. The baker's husband, the great titan of industry who was, in the end, nothing but a common thief who had built his career on a lie and been brought down by a kitchen ledger. Serafina Vance's fate was just as complete, though it involved no jail time. The massive canary-yellow engagement ring, which Richard had purchased on the company credit card, was unceremoniously repossessed by Abigail's new transition team. Her name, now toxic in Chicago society, became a punchline in the very gossip columns she had once dominated. She was last seen at O'Hare, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, boarding a one-way flight to Europe. She had gambled everything on a man she thought was a shark, only to find he was a fraud, and she was left with nothing. And Abigail? Abigail Davenport, now the sole owner of a $2 billion corporation, was, for a full week, completely terrified. She stayed in the penthouse, her penthouse, walking through its cavernous, sterile rooms, feeling like an imposter. The weight of this new life, this empire she had won but never asked for, was crushing. She was a baker, not a CEO. It was Helen Reed, now her personal counsel and friend, who sat with her at the massive marble dining table. "You don't have to be him, Abigail," Helen said, her voice grounding. "You don't have to be the shark he was. You just have to be smart, and you were always the smart one. You just let him convince you that you weren't." Helen's words broke the spell. Abigail wasn't a shark. She was a builder. Her first act as CEO was to systematically cleanse the company of Richard's toxic ego. She sold the Lakeshore Drive penthouse, its sterile modernity holding too many ghosts. She liquidated the flashy, high-risk trophy hotels and vanity projects that Richard had loved so much, the ones designed to get his picture in magazines. She renamed the entire corporation Hearthstone Properties, a name that felt solid, warm, and true. She kept the core commercial and residential buildings, the ones that were stable and provided real value to their tenants. She moved into a beautiful, but not ostentatious, brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Her next move was to assemble a new executive board. She pointedly hired the sharp, capable women whom Richard's old boys' club had always overlooked or dismissed as secretaries. Under her quiet, steady leadership, Hearthstone Properties became known not for hostile takeovers, but for its stability, its fair treatment of employees, and its deep investment in community philanthropy. But the true centerpiece of her new life was not a skyscraper. It was a small, brick and ivy-covered building on a sunny corner in her old neighborhood. She used her own money to buy it. She didn't franchise it. She didn't scale it. She just opened Abby's Hearth. It was simply a bakery. It smelled of cinnamon, fresh-baked sourdough, and her grandmother's lemon thyme recipes. It was warm, inviting, and always full. The press, of course, found this endlessly fascinating. They wrote countless articles about the billionaire baker who had won a $2 billion empire and returned to her roots. They photographed her with flour on her apron, her hands kneading dough. But for Abigail, it wasn't a story. It was her life. She worked there 3 days a week, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She kneaded the dough. She frosted the cakes. She knew her customers by name. This was not a performance. It was her anchor. This was the work that had started it all. And it was the work she loved. One Tuesday afternoon, as she was boxing up a loaf of bread, a young, nervous-looking woman came in, clutching her purse strap. "Mrs. Davenport?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Abigail, please," she smiled, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. I just had to come," the woman said, tears welling in her eyes. "I read your story. I'm in a difficult marriage. I've been a homemaker for 12 years. I have no money of my own, no real-world skills, as he calls it. I felt so trapped, so worthless." The woman took a shaky breath, but her eyes firmed. "And then I read what you did, what that kitchen ledger meant. You showed me that what we do, what we build in the kitchen, it matters, that our work has value, even if no one else is counting it." "Last week," she said, a small, proud smile appearing, "I enrolled in night school to get my paralegal degree. You gave me the courage." Abigail looked at this woman, this stranger, and saw a perfect reflection of herself. In that moment, she finally understood the purpose of her long, painful ordeal. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the revenge, or even the cold, hard slap of justice in that courtroom. It was this. It was the quiet, profound strength of a person who had been underestimated, a person who had been told to stay in her place, and who, by simply being reminded of her own value, had found the courage to reclaim her life. Abigail went to the counter and carefully boxed up a warm, fresh lemon scone. She handed it to the woman. "On the house." "Your worth," Abigail said, her voice full of a peace she had finally earned, "is the one thing no one can ever take from you. Don't ever let anyone, not even yourself, forget that." As the woman left, a new light in her eyes, Abigail looked around her beautiful simple bakery. Seraphina's sneering, dismissive words came back to her. You should really just stay in the kitchen. In the end, Abigail had done exactly that. She had stayed in the kitchen, and from there she ruled her empire. In the end, Seraphina was right. The entire case was decided by what happened in the kitchen. Not by the meals Abigail served, but by the business she built and the meticulous records she kept. Richard Davenport's $2 billion empire, built on a foundation of lies and a single arrogant forgery, crumbled back into the hands of its one true owner. It's a powerful, real-life reminder that the people you underestimate are almost always the ones holding all the cards. The goldfish you dismiss might just be the shark you never saw coming. What did you think of Abigail's incredible story of justice? Do you believe the verdict was fair? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you loved this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, true-life drama. Click that notification bell so you never miss a single update.